Hi, everybody. Welcome to the Santita Jackson Show here on AM 950 Radio, the voice of progressive Minnesota. I want you to meet my morning stars on the Santita Jackson Show YouTube channel. Like and subscribe. Click the bell so that you can get notified whenever we come on live. The Santita Jackson Show. Plus, you want to put some faces to these voices, right? And get involved with the conversation with the Santita Jackson Morning Stars. I promise you, you're going to get a lot out of it. And then, of course, the Santita Jackson and Friends Facebook page and AM 950 Radio's Facebook page as well. We want to engage with you. Indeed, there are only about 5 or 6 progressive stations, radio stations in the United States. Can you imagine? This was created as a right wing space. And yet, stations like AM 950 Radio hold on, and we need your support because we report of, for, and by you. So please, AM 950 Radio and am950radio.com, and please meet the Santita Jackson Morning Stars on the Santita Jackson and Friends page. Yesterday was primary day, and let's talk about the growth of the uncommitted movement, if you will, the uncommitted campaigns. 13% in Michigan. They thought they were aiming for 10,000 votes. They got 101,000 votes. They got almost 20% of the vote here in Minnesota. But there's much more to that story. But let's start with our priorities. In election 2024, we are trying to find out what the ask should be, what we should be asking of the president as he, at this time, as they seek our votes. We should be talking with our senators, with those candidates, with the people in the lower house, the U.S. representatives. But you should be engaged with people on the state level, on the county level, on the local level, in your wards, in your districts. This is how you get the things that you need. But the budget is set in Congress, and we need to look at that. It's a big budget. According to the National Priorities Project, there is $1.6 trillion in discretionary funding, but $1.1 trillion goes to the military. Only 499 billion go to you and me, to housing, to public health, things like that. So what do you make of that? What do you make of that? Do you agree with those priorities? $1.1 trillion going to the military and militarized spending, veterans programs, Department of Homeland Security, the Pentagon gets the biggest chunk of that, and on and on and on and on it goes. But only $499 billion for everything else. I want you to please meet us on the Santita Jackson and Friends page, and let's talk about it. Let's engage. Let's talk about our priorities. We're always scrambling for housing. You got 16 million vacant units of housing in the United States. You have fewer people who are homeless, but you have many more people who are living in substandard housing. We're not having that discussion, and we could. What about public health? In a nation of 330 to 340 million people, we don't even have 1 million hospital beds. How can that be? There are not 1 million hospital beds. There are a little more than 900,000 hospital beds, Attorney Mark Fancher. We're going to welcome Mike Ferner back to the show in just a minute, the executive director, national executive director of Veterans for Peace. But it just seems to me, when we were looking at COVID and the devastation wrought by COVID and that pandemic, we saw all of this death. We saw all of these hospitals that were overrun with patients. Little did we know that there are not even 1 million beds in the United States. We cannot even accommodate 1% of us if we get sick enough to be hospitalized. And then you see this $1.1 trillion. And that's just at this point, because they have not completely worked out the more than $11.6 billion that they're putting in the international military space. So talk to me. This is in the National Priorities Project. They do so much great work over there just to help us to see exactly what it is that we are doing. So, we've got Mike Ferner back with us, and I'm so glad that he is back here. And we have got, let me bring him on, and we are going to have Reverend Dr. Todd Yeary from the National Leadership Team of Rainbow Push. He is also a veteran and a lawyer, and he is the pastor of the iconic Douglas Memorial Community Church in Baltimore. He's one of 1,000 pastors who signed a letter informing the president that if he does not call for a ceasefire, he will not get their support. That is incredible. But let's start here, Mike Ferner, Veterans for Peace, and you have been a conscientious objector. You have gotten into the military, and you've seen something else once you got there. Talk to me about this one. Well, talk about what you saw once you got there, and make a comment. Talk to me about this $1.1 trillion for the military for $499 billion for everybody else.
Well, thank you very much, Santita. I'm glad to be back with you and with your distinguished guests here. You mentioned earlier about these budget priorities being absolutely insane. And in one way they are, but in another way, they're not insane at all, because the system isn't broken, it's fixed, and it's running perfectly for the criminals that are running the show. So with that understanding, we begin to get a better idea of why the priorities are placed the way they are, and why we have more than twice as much money for death and killing than we have for sustaining life. And a budget tells you what a city or a state or a country's priorities are. And it's really sad and tragic and maddening that we're living in a country that has priorities of death and suffering instead of life and compassion. So that's why it's like that. I learned quickly coming out of high school. I enlisted in the Navy with a head full of John Wayne movies, and not knowing from Shinola. And
that was good.
And so I was a hospital corpsman, and I worked in a Navy hospital and took care of guys that were coming back from Vietnam in bits and pieces. And that woke me up pretty quick. And as a 18, 19-year-old, I started learning what the world was about finally. And
well, let me ask you this. How did that reorder your world? Because I can only imagine then you come out of John Wayne, Elvis Presley, Motown. It was just a different time. It was a time of innocence. I guess the innocence was being broken with the murder of the president. And my mother said that happened when she was in college, when she and my father were in college. And she said it completely changed.
Well, that was a big shock. I was only 11 when that happened, but from the time I was 11 until I got out of high school, I was working in the summer hoeing soybeans and baling hay and cleaning out cow barns. So, it gives you an idea of the background that I came from, and very conservative in lots of ways. So I was raised Catholic, and the commandments were strictly carried out. Thou shalt not kill was strictly carried out, except if you're talking about communists. And then, it's an open season. So anyway, that is a thumbnail sketch of where that came from. But I went in for a lot of the same reasons young people go into the military all the time. Wanted to get out of the little town. It wasn't even a town that I was in, and see something. I wanted to feel like I was doing something for the country. Wanted to learn something. And at that time, I also wanted to not get drafted. So, and those are reasons people go in the military all the time. And then they go in and they find out real quick what the purpose of the military is. And the purpose of the military is the iron fist inside the velvet glove of empire. And if McDonald's and Boeing and Raytheon and all the other U.S. corporations don't get their way, they knock on the door of the CIA and ask for some help. And if that doesn't work in Central America or wherever, then they call in the aircraft carriers. And that's the way it works. We are an empire, and we do what empires do. It basically just comes down to that. And so we are paying taxpayers here. I was on the city council of Toledo for 4 years, and it was in the early 90s. And we were going through yet another recession, and we couldn't hardly keep the parks open, the health department open. It was a real struggle. We laid off all kind of people. And then I started doing the numbers, and I went to that cost of war study that you mentioned earlier at Brown University, and found out that when you take a look at the amount of tax money Toledoans were paying to the Pentagon every year, it was twice as much as we were paying to keep our city running. Now, that is, I fill in the blank what you want to call that, and I hold my tongue on a family radio show.
Thank you.
But it's maddening, to say the least. So there you have it. We're impoverishing our people here at home, destroying the environment by not doing the right things, not offering people the opportunities they should have as a citizen to advance themselves. For a matter of days, literally, of the expense of the Iraq and Afghanistan wars, taking that money would pay for everybody's college tuition in the United States. Now, it's not that we don't have any money. We got all kinds of money in this country. It's just that the people running the show have figured out a way to make as much money as they possibly can, and that doesn't necessarily relate to anything that the rest of us need. So,
no, but that's a whole lot. Did other people have awakenings similar to yours when you were in the military service? And is this something that you're seeing even today?
Oh, a lot of people had that awakening. I don't know if you've ever heard, or your guests have heard, the term fragging, but in Vietnam, soldiers got a little tired of being told to take the same hill over week after week. And if they're non-commissioned officers and lieutenants didn't listen to them, sometimes they woke up dead. And that happened more often than the military ever likes to acknowledge. And tens of thousands of men deserted, went to Canada, Sweden, just went underground. I was part of the movement inside the military where we did everything we could possibly do to keep our aircraft carrier from going back to Vietnam. And some people succeeded in some carriers tied up next to us by destroying mechanisms that would, so that they had to leave that thing in dry dock for 6 months. So it just went on and on and on. And we're seeing now, I'm hearing from people, active duty people in the military, in the State Department, that, well, look at Aaron Bushnell, for God's sake. I mean, you can't have a more extreme example of someone whose conscience has just torn them apart, and they feel the only adequate thing they can do is to make the sacrifice that he did. I mean, that's just amazing. That has been done in the past from time to time, but what our government's doing is not just killing people in Gaza and ruining their lives and all of that. We're driving people insane. There are people in this country who see what we're doing, and maybe they're not politically active, but it still gets into them, and it works on them. And they have a crisis of conscience. They don't know what to do. They might be not in the best mental health in the first place. Who knows? And that's what happens when you have a government that focuses on what's the best way to kill the most people, and that's our number one priority. So, and you get what you pay for.
Attorney Mark Fancher, $1.1 trillion toward militarized spending, $499 billion for everything else, public education, public health, you name it. That's it.
Yeah, it's this type of thing that helps you to fully appreciate just how idiotic, awful, and horrific capitalism is, because it is a system that essentially makes it possible for a few, an oligarchy, capitalists, to use government for purposes of enriching themselves. Government, the rhetoric of government is that government exists to serve the people. It exists to serve the oligarchy. And they do that in a number of different ways, and they exploit and oppress in their efforts to try and increase their profits, to increase their wealth. But one of the safest things historically that they have found, one of the safest ways that they found to do that is by saying that they need money for defense. And the reason that they can get away with it, or that they have gotten away with it for so long, is that they've been able to use fear. And when you have terrible monsters from overseas and terrorists and communists and who knows who else, who are all scheming and plotting to come down Main Street and to kill all of us and to enslave all of us and to cause chaos and havoc in the country that people love, then they are willing to just say, take as much money as you need. And so the capitalists have not been hesitant to do that. And it's not that the money goes to the Pentagon, it goes through the Pentagon and into the pockets and into the coffers of the defense contractors who sell them all kinds of things that they really don't need. They sell them bombers and bombs and weapons and all kinds of soldiers, supplies, and things that they really just do not need. And there's nobody to account for it. There's nobody to monitor them or to hold them accountable for what they're wasting their money on. But the defense contractors continue to just reap huge super profits, and they love it. And I think that, hearing Mr. Ferner describe the experience of Vietnam should be a reminder to the rest of us of just, in some ways, what a victory that was. Because in the same way that the defense contractors continue to use government in order to make huge profits off of the sale of goods, there have historically been opportunities for them to, in addition, exploit human beings in the process of doing that. So that when wars were waged, it was always possible to enlist, to conscript large numbers of people to go and fight wars. And when you do that, then you got to put them in boots. You got to give them rifles. You got to give them food. You got to give them supplies. Lots of money to be made with soldiers overseas. And then when you have Vietnam, which was an explicitly and implicitly an imperialist war, it could not be missed even by the most uninformed person. Then all of these well-meaning young people, most of them drafted, but many of them who volunteered to go, thinking that they were going to defend democracy, thinking that they were going to fight a noble war, when they get there and they find out what they're actually doing, which is opposing an honest-to-goodness liberation struggle in the interest of dominating the planet for the major corporations and multinationals. And then all of these lives are lost, and all of these families are getting their kids' bodies back in body bags. Then the country as a whole made a collective decision not to ever allow this type of thing again. And the Pentagon, the White House, they have not been able to wage wars in just that way since that time. They have deployed troops, but every time that they do that, they have to go through extraordinary steps in order to come up with a rationale or to justify it. And even when they can get away with justifying deploying troops, there's always a very clear message that's coming from the people that we're going to let you do this, but you better get these people back really quickly, and they all better come back alive. And so it has made it necessary for them to limit the number of wars that they wage with people now. And they've had to move to the use of drones. And they've had to use, they're working on developing the capacity to wage wars with robot soldiers. And so that they can minimize the use of actual soldiers to fight these wars. And what has also been useful for them is the use of proxy forces. They have them in a number of different contexts. I mean, they used to use Contras in Nicaragua, and all kinds of mercenary forces and things like that. In Africa, U.S. Africa Command sends U.S. military advisors to direct Africa's armies to carry out missions on behalf of the United States. But by far the best proxy that they have has been the Israeli Defense Force. And they have just done a magnificent job as far as the defense contractors are concerned, with devastating Gaza, because now they are in the process of clearing the way for the development of fancy resort areas and making it possible for them to go and get the oil that's been discovered there. And there hasn't been one drop of U.S. blood spilled in the process of doing it. So it is such an elaborate enterprise. It's not just a matter of providing them with the weapons of war and making money off of it, but there's also disaster capitalism, where when you have a place like Ukraine or Gaza or any place that's been just totally devastated, there are so many contractors that are just waiting to go in there and rebuild to the cost of trillions and trillions of dollars. And the more wars, the better, as far as they're concerned. The more devastation, the better. And that's where the money needs to go. And it does not need to go to the needs of the domestic population, because they don't help make you rich at all. I mean, to the extent that they have made you rich in terms of providing a market for consumer goods. Everybody's bought everything now. They've got all of the electronic gadgets that they need. They've bought all the microwave ovens. They've bought all the cars. They've bought all of the things that they've been selling to people. They don't have, and then you've got so many people who are unemployed who don't have incomes anymore, nothing to spend money on anyway. So this is really, the U.S. domestic population is sort of a useless population. They can't use them as soldiers. They cost too much to employ them as workers. So because you can get workers at a much cheaper cost overseas, and they're not a market. I mean, they don't have money, and if they had money, they wouldn't spend it on the stuff that we sell anyway, because they've already bought everything. So it's a useless population. It doesn't make sense to spend any money on them. And so we'll just let them drift. But, because people who think this way are so short-sighted, and their greed causes them only to think of their immediate needs and their immediate circumstances, then they neglect to think about what the long-term consequences of all of this are. And they end up going the way of all empires, in that they collapse. They send all of their money overseas to maintain the empire, and they don't take care of home, and it just collapses from within, because there's nothing left here. And it's hard for them to recognize. Well, they can recognize it, but they just don't care, because that's just the nature of the system.
You, Mike Ferner, I saw both thumbs go up. What resonated?
Excellent analysis. Excellent, based on history, based on current economics, based on how these criminals who run the system operate. And, the politicians, the only thing they think about, and there are a few with consciences, but they are in such a tiny minority, it's a shame. But the vast majority of them think about the next election and what do they have to do to get reelected, and don't say anything that's going to upset anybody, and get the money from the people who've got it, and play the game. And that's how that goes. And the people that are not in government, but they're making money on this game. They're looking at the next quarter's profits. And what Mr. Fancher was saying about the domestic population here isn't of much use for all the reasons that he cited, is a really good way of stopping for a minute and considering why it is that our interests aren't met. And that video that I sent to you, I don't know if you had a chance to play it today or not, but maybe some other time, if not. But in there, I'm addressing a rally in Columbus about a ceasefire in Gaza. And I'm calling out the people who are running the country as madmen, arsonists, because they go around and set fires all over the globe. And those of us here in the peace movement and other movements, we go around with buckets of water and try to take care of what they have started. And that's impossible. And we have to find a way to take their matches away and stop the madmen, arsonists from doing what they're doing. And the way you do that is to take away the rights of corporations to lobby and advertise and write legislation and all the things that the Constitution now, since the Supreme Court has handed over all these rights to corporations, they use these rights to run the government. They are now governing, in my opinion, in the opinion of a number of people in the movement. So the corporations are governing. For us to think we're going to get anything out of that except coincidental benefit, a collateral benefit, whatever you want to call it, a side benefit to what the corporations want. If we think we're going to get anything more than that, we are fools. And until we wake up to that point, to that fact, and start organizing and educating a little more smartly, we're going to be chasing our tails. And I've been chasing my tail since I got out of the Navy, fighting for peace and justice. And I really don't intend to do it for the remaining years that I have.
What about the militarization? It doesn't just stop at the Pentagon, does it? I mean, we had President Eisenhower the night before he handed the reins over to President John F. Kennedy, who was a war veteran and someone who, it turns out, really fought imperialism and fought these wars. He got into Vietnam, but that was a bit of a jam. I think he got jammed into that. At least that's my reading of a lot of these documents that are being released now. That was something he wanted to talk to Khrushchev, and he did. And he said, we need to have a détente way before we saw that. But we're watching the militarization of our police.
Yeah.
And the FBI and the CIA. And it's not stopping. I mean, and I think that if we stop Mike Ferner and attorney Mark Fancher and Reverend Dr. Todd Deary, who's joining us now, I think if we stop as we look and just look at the military itself, the military proper, I think we might be missing something, Mike Ferner.
Yeah. Well, what we do abroad generally winds up coming back home. Mm-hmm. You know, that's one thing you can pretty much count on. And
Dr. King said that the bombs we drop overseas would explode at home. Is that what you're seeing?
That and the fact that, you know, the military contractors, you know, you can just right now we're using up all the stockpiles that we have for Ukraine and Palestine. Mm-hmm. But you know, there's comes to a point where that market sometimes gets saturated. But then the federal government tells the cities, "Oh, you can have this stuff for free." So now we got armored personnel carriers going down our street and everything else. And I'd love to hear from Reverend Dr. Deary because
he's a fellow veteran.
What branch, Reverend?
I was in the Army.
I was in the Navy.
I enlisted in '85. I heard your comment about when you joined and why you joined. At the time, it was the GI Bill benefits that would support educational pursuits, and the trade-off was for a 6x2, as we called the contract back then, it would allow us to access resources to get student loan repayment and the stipend to be able to cover the cost of college, which was certainly beginning to escalate, nowhere near where it is now, but it was high even then. But to the point about our military spending, that last point, Santita, that you made, is that we have military spending and then we have paramilitary spending. Let's understand that police forces are paramilitary units. They often try to mimic, though not with a whole lot of precision, the rank structure. You often see leaders of police departments with either colonel's wings or stars on their collars like they're generals, because the rank is actually to imitate or to be the city version or the town version of what the military is to the nation. And so when we look at military spending and we consider it holistically, not only do we have this aberration at the federal government level, but you also see it in terms of expenses at the local level. And so really, you're getting hammered in terms of dollars that could be used for human services, for resourcing communities, for making sure that you've got housing and a healthy environment, so that your reliance on paramilitary structures to enforce rigid expectations about where you can go, when you can go, who you can go with, and if you violate those norms, then the hammer of accountability falls on you. There is a straight line that what we see as the imitation of the federal government's excessive and even sickening spending is now being replicated across the country. And then you have an election where the threats to all of the what they call social safety net spending is always the way that they want to make the cuts, but there's never a conversation about cutting the defense budget. So much so that recently what we've seen is that what ends up being appropriated exceeds what the administration has even requested. So when the Congress will come back and say, I'm going to give you more money than you asked for to be able to handle the military, it says not only have we gone overboard, and I heard Mike recognize that this is a family show, but he didn't know whether or not there was a word he could use. It's bullshiggity. That's what this is.
Can we just say balderdash?
That's what I said. I said balderdash, bullshiggity. It's an overt recognition that, to my good brother Mark Fancher's point about empire, Mike mentioned empire. The empire does imperialistic things, and it is to protect itself. That's what the military is really used for, to protect the interests and the expectations of the elites, the oligarchy, the emperors, if you will, in capital E and lowercase e form. That's what the military is really there to do. The military is not there to keep regular folks safe. The police are not there to keep regular folks safe. It is to protect, as policing historically was. They was created for two purposes. One, the interests for those who owned land, and then to be slave catchers. There's property interests all the way around. And so the property interest of the empire is to protect the empire and to give the rest of us the sense that when the budget comes out, there's something in there for the rest of us, albeit disproportionately to not only the direct costs that you see show up in the defense budget, but indirect costs that show up under other line items, but find its way back to supporting Department of Defense related initiatives. So when we look at the math, the reason they come up, they never talk about having to balance the budget by cutting military spending. The deficit fiction that they often impose on the rest of us is to give the impression that somehow or other the needs of the people are always excessive to the needs of the state, the government. And so it's that kind of just kind of inconsistent, backwards thinking that has become the norm, and has always been the norm. When they figured out they could have a military that they could fund money to initially to protect the interests of the colonies, the original 13, from invasion and repatriation by the crown, it's now become this is how we can make sure we can take care of all of our friends. If you want to become really, really rich overnight, we saw it with Dick Cheney and his relationship with Blackwater. We see it now with Betsy DeVos's brother in the same way. If you want to be really, really rich, go into a related military line. Don't be you don't have to be educated. You don't have to be smart. You just have to be willing to be violent for the cause of the empire. And there you have it. Meanwhile, you have young people signing up for, as my dad called it when he was stationed over at Tan Son Nhut during Vietnam at the airport when he became an air traffic controller. You have young folks signing up for this notion of patriotism, but what they're really signing up to be is expendable entities for the sake of the empire. And so it is a bastardization of the notion of what being about country is all about. We're told we're about country. They're about the state, and they are not the same.
What is the difference?
Well, the state is used to be synonymous with the country, but the state has to do with government interests, right? The notion of country has to do with citizens. That's a people formula, but we know the definition of citizen has had a very fluid definition over time. But when it comes to the Secretary of State, who represents the interests of the empire, the President of the United States, when he goes across the world, never comes back to the interests of the people. It is always tied to the geopolitics of the empire. How do I extend my imperial reach to protect imperial interests for imperial gain?
Attorney Mark Fancher, what is this doing to our children? This is their only option. You know, if you're trying to get out from under, you've got to go into the military. And as Elizabeth Ward Howe wrote in her call for Mother's Day for Peace, she said, I've got to teach you to unlearn everything I taught you about ethics, Christian values, or Jewish values, or Buddhist values, or Baha'i values. I mean, all the great values of the universe. You got to unlearn all of this in order to go to college, in order to eat. And we don't have a correlative for peace, Mike Ferner. We don't, that's not the way that works. I mean, Mark Fancher, first to you.
Yeah, well, certainly there are still many young people who see military as the only option, but an increasing number of them, because of their communities, are no longer considering it as an option. One of the great untold stories is that I credit the Black community with ending the Iraq War. And that's because the Army did studies in terms of recruitment, and they found that after Iraq was invaded, they found that the recruitment levels in Black communities plummeted. And when they dug down and found out why, it was because thought leaders and role models and leaders within the Black community were telling kids, do not go. The pastors, the teachers, they were saying, do not do that. And I heard one anecdote where a mother, a young man said that he had approached his mother and suggested to her that he was thinking about enlisting. And her response was, if you want to enlist and get shot, don't even bother, because if you go that direction, I'll shoot you. And so I think that what it has done is it has taken away many of the human bodies that the military has historically relied on for purposes of fighting these wars. And at the same time created a crisis for young people who don't have that option that they've relied on in the past. for purposes of getting higher education and other things. But it's had other consequences as well. And that is, there was a reference earlier to the militarization of police. Part of the reason for that is because of what has happened to the consciousness of the people of this country. There was a time, and I know some of it is romanticized, but certainly the image of Officer McGillicuddy on the corner, who is the friend of all and whose primary responsibility is to get cats out of trees and to help older women across the street, wasn't too far removed from reality to a point, at least in white communities, because they were valued. This population was valued because this is where our soldiers are going to come from. And we need to take care of them. We need to make sure that they prosper and that they're healthy and that they're educated and intelligent, because we're going to give them guns and uniforms and expect them to go over and fight for us. At the same time, Black communities in particular were not having that same friendly officer experience. And the reason that Black communities weren't having that experience is because historically the state had been forcing them to do whatever they wanted them to do anyway. And if they needed them to go to war, then they forced them to go to war, no problem. But they were also very rebellious. And in a sense, they were an enemy. And so they had to be dealt with like an enemy. And so the relationship between Black communities and law enforcement has always been toxic and antagonistic and hostile, because they were an enemy population that had to be dealt with. So you have friendly officers in the white community and officers in the Black community who were knocking people in the head. And if they started resisting, as they feared that they might, then they'd stick dogs on them and train fire hoses on them and do whatever they had to do in order to keep them in line, or create a COINTELPRO program in order to infiltrate them and to bring them down and subvert them and to cause their disorganization and disintegration of their movements. But what has happened with the rising level of consciousness across the board is that now even white youth understand many of the contradictions. They have begun to resist in ways that are not helpful to the empire. And so what it means is that police just generally now have to identify their enemies, who are us. And they have to begin to act like an occupying force would act in any war zone, regardless of who it might be. And so when you have all of these kids, whether they're white, Black, brown, whoever they may be, and taking to the street, protesting what happened to George Floyd, or protesting what's happening in Gaza, what's happening, anything that they're protesting, then the reaction is heavy-handed and brutal. And and again, this goes back to the anti-Vietnam protests, where for one of the first times they began to treat them in a militarized sort of a way. So the police see the people of this country as enemies. The empire sees them as enemies. And so it's necessary for the police to be militarized, because they're just another population that has to be controlled and dominated, just like they control and dominate populations overseas.
Mike Ferner, I mean, you've been in this struggle now for 6 decades. Where do we go from here? I mean, the military budget just continues to mushroom. And the militarization that Dwight Eisenhower told us, he said, this will not only have a material impact that will be negative, but this will have a spiritual impact that will be negative. You don't know what we're walking into, you all. So I'm warning you. Let's not go down this road, and here we are.
Yep.
I mean, what do you think he was thinking? What did he see that so many people missed?
Well, he saw the economic power because of the spending that we've been talking about.
Mm-hmm.
We did not disarm after World War II. He saw the spending that was going to continue, and he saw the fact that economic power is going to lead and always does lead directly to political power.
Hmm.
So therein lies the danger for society, because you've got people with interests that are diametrically opposed to what most people need who are running the show. And you asked, where do we go from here?
Hmm.
I'm beginning to make some inroads in my own organization, and just starting with this idea of cutting off corporations' constitutional protections. And we've got to take that seriously, because anything that we do to try to fix the climate or do this or do that, the show is being run by whom we know it's being run by, and they have control of the government. They've got control of the government because the Supreme Court has given them every constitutional protection of human beings, and they can do whatever they want. And until we change that, APAC and General Dynamics and you name the corporation or the lobbying group, they're going to do what they always do. And if we think otherwise, we're foolish. Until the day comes when APAC and General Dynamics and so forth and so on, when their lobbyists walk down the halls of Congress and somebody says, stop, wait a minute, you can't lobby here. And they say, wait a minute, this is our First Amendment rights. And the response is, you no longer have First Amendment rights. That's, in my opinion, that's where we need to go. And I'm hoping to get that message across to as many people in Veterans for Peace as possible, and other activists around the country, because like I said, I've chased my tail for 60 years doing this, and fought the good fight and felt like I was doing something, and hopefully have done something. But who always comes up on top? You take all of the movements that we're involved in, all of them. I've been in the labor movement, the peace movement, all kinds of stuff. And you take all of those movements that are the brothers here have been in, that you've been in, that your father's been in. You look at all those movements and all the time and energy that's gone into that. Yeah, there's been some good that's come of it. No.
Mhm.
I mean, things would be worse if not for that effort. But with that much effort and talent and intelligence, we're always winding up with the same craven little despots running the show. We're not doing something right here. So
Mhm.
I'll leave it at that.
Well, I will say this, Reverend Dr. Uri, he's part of the original Rainbow. He's one of Reverend Jackson's delegates. Reverend even did a commercial for him when he ran for office. But we go way back. This is when you were an outlaw, or when you decided to run with Jesse Jackson for president. It was, in hindsight, Attorney Mark Fancher and Reverend Dr. Uri, it was the right thing to do. You were making history. No, then people thought you were not just crazy, but you were dangerous.
Yep.
You were dangerous. That's why I think, when we talk about how we're dealing with our politics now, we have to be very careful, because we didn't look at Muhammad Ali as being dangerous when he was in a wheelchair.
Yeah.
And now that Reverend's in a wheelchair, oh my goodness, he's not dangerous. But in their time, absolutely. And even the conversation that we're having now, you can't see it in corporate media. I'm not worried about that, because I know the truth crushed to the earth will always rise. But where do we go from here? I only have about 3 minutes left, just under that. Reverend Dr. Uri?
Well, we go back to movement making, right? That's the answer. What it looks like in a 2024 iteration is going to look differently than 1954, right? The year of Brown v. Board. The other thing is recognizing that we're moving against something that's much different than anything we've seen, even as we've been talking, and as Mark was talking about the diminishing returns on people enlistments. The model of military has also changed, right? It's going the way of remote warfare to be able to exact the same kinds of harms while being detached from the immediacy of the trauma of being exposed to it, right? The problem with this ongoing war on terror is it went back to more of what we would call a conventional type of fighting in more of an urban context, right? It was different in that regard. But when you now have another branch of the military called the Space Force, right? It's indicating that the methodology of warfare is changing. The commitment to it is not. And so the investment having to go into technology when we're fighting with stealth fighters, stealth bombers, with drones, with that kind of distancing from what we once called the theater of war. It now creates this conception that somehow or other this notion of warfare is not as violent, not as costly in terms of human capital, but the trauma of killing even remotely when it's happening at your hands is still as dangerous as, I was probably one of the last classes of enlistees back in the mid 1980s that as part of basic training, we still had bayonet training. We still learned hand-to-hand combat because the sense of battle was still the old design, like the big bag of green army men that you would buy and line them up on the floor with somebody laying in the prone position with a rifle and someone that was firing mortar. But at the same time, when I enlisted, Grenada was going on, and we were beginning to see this difference. And so where do we go from here? More movement making is the only answer.
And don't buy those little green men for your children. Just stop. My mother refused to do that, Mr. Furner. She refused, Attorney Fancher. She said, I'm not going to train you to do that. When West Point came to the door to recruit me, she stopped them right there. She said, first of all, you didn't come here and ask for a father. I got a problem with you on that. But we believe in peace here. And they said the best looking guys ever. Let me just tell you that. She said, that's not what we do. You got to make a decision, everybody, whether you're going to support war or peace. And that is not, we're not talking about our warriors. We're talking about the principle of war or peace. Do you want peace? Do you want peace? Choose. We don't have to lose, everybody. Mike Furner, Veterans for Peace, how we are going to support you, Veterans for Peace. There is a walk for peace that you're going to have right now. Please, everybody, please support Veterans for Peace.
.org.
.org, veteransforpeace.org. I'm going to be talking about the election 2024 in the next hour, everybody. Election 2024. While Biden is struggling at the top, and while some people have doubts about President Trump, there are so many elections that are going on down ballot. Even the gentleman who is the judge in the Fani Willis case, he is up for election and he's running unopposed. How's that changing? How's that shaping how he's adjudicating this case? Got to talk about that and so much more. And on this primary day, guess what? The Uncommitted movement is growing. Love you both. Love all three of you. God bless you. Have a great one. Stay tuned for the second hour for the Santita Jackson Show here on AM